And Das Kenim brings that even your lives I will seek, referring to somebody who takes even their own life. And they bring the drasha. I might have thought that even like Mishal Chanani Azariah, we're going to explain it, that maybe you should not take your life. Talmud Leimer, you may take their life. And he explains it like this, the first pirush, that maybe you cannot take your own life in a situation like Chanani Mishal Azariah, when you're threatened with death if you do not conform to the requests of to transgress the Torah, and maybe, or you're concerned, the person thinks that they will not be able to maintain their composure at the time of great a great test, conditions of great fear, and they will in the fear of the moment they will not they will comply with the order, and therefore in order to prevent that transgression of the Torah, perhaps one might think you cannot take your own life. So the Torah tells us that you can take your own life to ensure that you do not transgress the Torah under circumstances of Shmad. Because B'shas Shmad, the time of when there's a decree of the nations of the world to uproot the Torah and to forcibly convert Jews to heathen practices, under these circumstances one may take one's life, not just sacrifice one's life under the actual conditions of forcible conversion, but even prior thereto, in anticipation of a potential failure to defy the threats. In anticipation of that failure, one may take one's life in advance, as Shaul did, that he told the aide that was with him he should take his life, and he also and then finish off his life in anticipation of what otherwise might have transpired to him. From that we see that a person can take their life in anticipation of such such trials. And there are those who sought to bring a proof from here that what happens if you have young children that are going to be forcibly baptized? Is one permitted to take their lives in order to prevent this from occurring? And they bring a proof from this medrash that it would be permissible, because otherwise obviously young children will succumb to that test readily, and therefore to prevent that one may take their lives. V'yesh oisrim, however, there are those who do not permit this, and they explain the medrash differently. It means like this, that I might have thought you cannot take your life, says Achas Dimcha, you should not take your own life, even like Hananiah, Mishav Azariah, who sacrificed their life to jump into the fiery furnace of Nebuchadnezzar and to be cremated alive. They were prepared to do that. I might have thought that that's also not permissible. That is that one is allowed at the time of Misa, at the time actually when they're forcing you, forcible conversion or transgression, one may opt to sacrifice one's life rather than transgress the Torah, but to do so prior to take one's own life in anticipation of that, one may not do. In a yochel lariges hatzmai, a person may not take their own life even in anticipation of potential failure. And maybe you might think, yes, but maybe you can't actively take your life, but maybe like Shaul, that you can allow your life to be taken beforehand. Like Shaul said, I'm not going to take my own life, but he instructed someone else to take his life. Maybe that would be permissible. Even that's not permissible. You're not allowed in anticipation of circumstances, trying circumstances, one is not allowed to take or even allow one's life to be taken in advance. One cannot in any way, not just that, one cannot in any way, like Shaul, not just allow his life to be taken, but injured himself, or not even allowed to inflict injury upon oneself in anticipation. So there are two opinions here. Does this medrash tell us that a person is allowed to take one's own life in anticipation of such a trial, or is one not allowed to take one's life in anticipation of this? The question was what Shaul did permissible or no? What Shaul did was actually inappropriate. And he says, who's this? This is Maharash Bar Avraham Hamechuna Uchman. Interesting name. That's what Rosh brings. This is Maharash Bar Avraham Hamechuna Uchman. And he brings a story, a remarkable story, that there was a Rav who, in the time of Shmat, there was a decree of the nations of the world against the Jews that they should transgress and convert, forcible conversion. And the Rav himself went around and took the tinoikis, the young children, and forcibly slaughtered them, so that they would not be subjected to the risk of forcible conversion. And there was another Rav who was with him, who was extremely angry with him, and he called him a ritzech. He said, "You are a murderer." This Rav, this initial Rav, was not perturbed by this. So the other Rav who objected said, "If I am correct, then it will be that Shomayim, the heavens, will show this by bringing about a Misa Meshuna, a strange and unusual type of death to this Rav." That's what actually happened. That's what transpired. The Goyim took him and they captured them, and for whatever reason, and Poishtin Oiroi, they took his skin and separated it from him. They unpeeled his skin from his flesh and placed sand between the skin and his flesh. That was the Misa Meshuna. And after that, Nispatla Gezerah, the decree itself was renounced and nullified. And he concludes that had these children not been slaughtered by this Rav, they would have been saved, because the decree itself was annulled. Therefore, this was the wrong. If he proved this is the wrong approach. Very dramatic. We're going to suggest that, and we're going to, before you just jump out of your seat in surprise and shock and dismay and whatever, we're going to try and illustrate where it's coming from. Rosh is saying something. First of all, let's try and understand the rationale. What is this discussion? What is the argument? And we can suggest that the fundamental argument between these two opinions is, again, like we described with Noach ish tzaddik. It's coming back to that fundamental question. Is a person fundamentally expected to be a tzaddik or not? That has two implications. First of all, do we expect a person in the time of test, if man fundamentally is righteous, then in time of test and tribulation and trial, we will expect expectations the person will be able to successfully endure the trial and not succumb. And if a person is fundamental expectation, person is not righteous, then the expectation is they will succumb to the trial. Another nafkamina we can suggest. First of all, this was the discussion between the two opposing opinions. The opinion that said that one may take one's own life in anticipation of a trial, because in anticipation of succumbing, perhaps says that we assume fundamentally that man is not righteous and will succumb in the face of trial, and therefore he's permitted to take his life to ensure that he does not succumb. And the other opinion says, Chas v'sholem, says no, a person may not take their own life, because there is no such assumption. Man perhaps is fundamentally righteous, therefore we cannot say there's an assumption that he will succumb at this trial. That's first of all. And perhaps there's another implication to this. How do we view the sanctity of life? It may be the opinion that says that fundamentally man is not viewed as righteous, as being assumed to be righteous, also says perhaps the sanctity of life is thereby also correspondingly diminished. Since life is not fundamentally expected to devote and to sacrifice itself for the will of Hashem. Therefore, life itself is less than absolute, holds less than absolute sanctity. The other opinion that holds that we assume that man is fundamentally righteously orientated would say that life thereby is correspondingly sacrosanct. Therefore, we can say the opinion of the camp that held that one may take one's own life in anticipation of the fact that will very possibly succumb to the trial and will not be successful, and therefore one can take one's own life. Correspondingly, this opinion itself holds that the sanctity of life itself is not so absolutely sacrosanct. People are not fundamentally good, and therefore life is expendable. And in accordance with that, this Rav went and shechted and allowed himself the right to slaughter these unfortunate children in anticipation of the fact that they were going to perhaps fail in this trial or perhaps in other trials of their life, and therefore, maybe like Beis Shammai, maybe it's overall, who's taking this halacha l'maisa, it's preferable that person would not be born, because ultimately he's going to sin. The other opinion, of course, the counter opinion to that was, no, man is fundamentally orientated towards good, therefore we cannot assume he will succumb to test, and therefore life also is correspondingly sacrosanct. Man is fundamentally just, and thereby entitled to life, and therefore there was no permission whatsoever for this Rav to take the lives of these children. We're going to suggest, and we're going to come from somewhere else, from left field, that this is, there's something in mind here. That, what does this conjure up? What image does this conjure up? This Rav shechting, slaughtering these children. Perhaps he wasn't just saying that this is something that logic and the way I explain the Medrash entitles me to take this extreme action. Rather, maybe there's also precedent. Maybe Hashem himself instructed Avram that he should take the life of Yitzchak. Maybe somehow that would seem something of an aberration, that exegesis, that explanation of that. Nevertheless, perhaps that would also provide some form of source, the potential justification of taking the life of a child in extreme circumstances. And I'm going to suggest there's a number of allusions here, and before you hear them, in the wording of the Rosh, of the Das Kenim, which might seem unusual, but surrounding the incidents of the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak, we have three protagonists, Sarah, Yitzchak, and Avram. Umaise berav echod, Umaise berav. So you've also got Shin, Hey, Beis, Reish. So you got Besora. Sarah was a victim of these events. Sheshochat harbe. Shin Reish Hey, Shochat harbe. Tinoikis. Yes, this moment is over imaginative. And he called him a Kol Reitzeach, v'hu lo yahya choishish. Kol Reitzeach, v'hu lo yahya choishish. From Reitzeach, v'hu lo yahya choishish. Reitzeach is Tzadik Ches, 98 plus 12 from v'hu is 110, 116, 140, 647. That's Yaakov. V'hu lo yahya choishish. Aleph, Lamed Aleph is 32, Hey is 5, is 37. That's how old Yitzchak was at the time of the Akedah. V'omar Oisei Rav, really we need a blackboard to illustrate this. Im Kidvora Yihoreg, Horag is Yitzchak 208. Oisei Rav, Vav Reish Beis is 108, 208 is Yitzchak. That's all conjecture at the moment. What was his death? So first of all, I suggest that the Rav said in Kidvorai, they're putting choil bein oila basar. We're separating the skin from the flesh, which is something excruciatingly agonizing. Perhaps the other Rav felt that people were naturally inclined that one can take one's life because in the anticipation of almost succumb to trial of pain, because one is over-attached to one's life, to one's flesh. And perhaps this was his divine punishment, that the choil, the mundane, separated, his flesh and his skin separated one from another. Perhaps it's not such an over-attachment. When it comes to holy matters, a person can perhaps separate themselves. Anyway, bein ha'oiv ha'bosor ve'ha'bosor, you got the word sorrow. Sorrow, ve'ha'bosor, shin reish hey. Then you got the Vav base ve'habosor and the Reish ha'or ve'habosor. The Reish is Yitzchok, Reish base Vav. You got Sorah Yitzchok. There are others, I'm not going to go into them. But if we take, what was the name? The Tosfos brings an interesting name of who's quoted as this whole passage. Maharash bar Avrom hamechune Uchman. Interesting, yeah. Maharash perhaps is Hey Reishin. Sarah bar Avraham. You got Sarah and Avraham. Hamechune Uchman. So let's take the word Hamechune, which is 14 is 50 is 90, 126 plus the Aleph afterwards, 127 of Uchman. Hamechune Uchman 127. Sarah and Avraham, and you've got, it happened to be that at the age of 127 she was taken away. Maybe it's all conjecture and coincidence and over fertile, contrived letter combinations. Perhaps. Maybe we can say we took the Aleph of Uchman and we used it for the 127. So let's do it again. Uchman without the Aleph is 90 plus 20 is 110. Plus the Vav is 116. And let's take the Heya Mechuna, 121, and the Vav Umaisa after that. It's 127, again 127. Again, all conjecture. Let's look at the parasha. Where is he talking about? Va'achas dimchem lenafsho yisichem edroish miyad kol chayo edroshenu. Taking one's own life, taking life of another human being, shechting children, chas v'sholim. Edroish, look at the word edroish. Achas dimchem lenafsho yisichem edroish. You take the life of someone, edroish, I will take your life. What was the sequence of events? Avram was told to do the Kedah. Shechted Yitzchak almost, and as a result, what happened? Sarah perished. The Sultan came to Sarah. Edroish is Shin Reish, is Aleph Dalet Reish Shin, which is Sarah. Miyad Kol Chayo Edroshenu. Again, Aleph Dalet Reish Shin, Edroshenu. Sarah, Shin Reish Hey. Okay. Sarah, the beginning and the end. Maybe the run is Miyad Kol Chayo. Let's take that. Miyad is 54. Plus Kol is 104, 104. Chayo is 104 plus 8, 112, 122. Hey, 127. Sarah was 127. So we got Sarah, 127. Chayo, Miyad Kol Chayo, Ches Yud Hey. Edroshenu, Aleph Dalet is Hey. Ches Yud, Yud. Chaye Sarah, 127. So maybe this is something the Rosh and the Daskeni maybe is perhaps speculating, also taking this as intimately connected with the events of the Akedah itself. More than that, I don't think we can say. And then finally we have the event of Noach. What does he do after Shem gives the covenant? Hashem, we forgot about the rainbow. Hashem issues another promise that perhaps Noach was nevertheless still disinclined to populate the world. He was concerned that maybe there's going to be another flood, and Hashem says, I'm offering a covenant, a bris, and Hashem says, I'm going to actually offer a visual representation of this in the form of the keshes, that whenever it rains, that the refracted light will appear in the form of the keshes. And you look in the Ramban, the implication is perhaps it is the phenomenon of refraction, where the light passes through the water. And what is this bris? And one can explain, one can suggest, this is all about, again, the primary theme we've been discussing about inspiration. That the righteous inspiration that exists in the world. And this is perhaps the deeper level of the bris. Hashem says, I'm going to be associated with the world. I am going, and that is the bris, that's the covenant. If I'm a part of the world, first of all, that is to a certain extent the guarantee the world cannot be destroyed, because it's the world of Hashem, in which Hashem is a part of. And that's perhaps on a technical, legal level. But perhaps one can say there is a more substantive understanding to this, namely that if Hashem invests his identity with the world, that actually means that Hashem is, so to speak, bringing to bear the omnipotent inspirational power of what Hashem represents. Hashem represents the infinite power of doing good, which is to a certain extent revealed and to a certain extent hidden. The actual creation itself is a manifestation of this benevolence, this divine benevolence. And Hashem, in saying, I'm creating a covenant, is perhaps enhancing that and saying, I'm going to provide a greater impetus for mankind, for people, for the world, to be inspired by, to conduct themselves positively. Ultimately, maybe that would express itself in giving of the Torah, and Hashem choosing His people, and perhaps focusing on, again, a particular segment of humanity that was amenable to this. But overall, Hashem is saying, this is my covenant with mankind, meaning that I am here, I'm a part of you. Man cannot say anymore that I am purely a materialistic entity that is founded purely on principles of cause and effect. Rather, Hashem now is saying you are invested at the deepest level with the spiritual impetus of Hashem Himself. And that is the guarantee that the world will not be destroyed. Because that, as a response, as we said, that man fundamentally is always going to be orientated towards good, and therefore there's always going to be hope for man, because Hashem is invested. Hashem is part of man, and man is in the image of Hashem, and man is inspired, and part of that inspiration is a part of man's very soul. Therefore, there is always going to be a hope for man. Maybe this was the representation. The symbolic representation of this was refraction. One can suggest this is actually reflecting this notion itself. What is refraction? Refraction is when light passes through a medium, transparent medium, such as water, and we know that light consists of multiple types of radiation, and from the ultraviolet through to all the various part of the spectrum, the radioactive spectrum, and certain of which are visible, and even among the visible, when combined together they form white light, transparent light, but when they are refracted at different angles, depending on their wavelength, etc., they then separate out into their individual colors. And perhaps the remarkable part of this phenomenon, one might say, is there's a fundamental debate in physics. There was, and I think it's still ongoing. What is fundamentally light? Is light a particle, a photon, let's say, or is light energy? And we can take that on a philosophical level and say, is light spiritual or is light physical? What fundamentally is it? Is it a spiritual entity or a physical entity? One can say, and it exhibits properties of both. And we've spoken about this. And one can say, to the extent that it is a spiritual entity, in which case, when it would encounter a physical entity, perhaps there would be no possibility, essentially, of an interaction between these two completely differing dimensions, differing entities. They're like different universes. This is the spiritual and this is the physical. One cannot impact upon the other. The phenomenon of refraction is perhaps a visual representation of the potential of that which is almost completely spiritual, has no essentially physical weight or being or matter or mass light, yet it is able to interact with something that is purely physical, with water, the most basic level. Therefore, one can impress upon the other. Water will impress upon the light. With every reaction, light will also be somewhat impacting on the water. The reflection of the light itself is an ever so slight effect of releasing photon, of releasing electrons, which convert into electromagnetic radiation themselves. And therefore, the water, in a very subtle, small level, is actually sort of burnt, is inspired, is heated up by the light. And that is perhaps interaction between the spiritual and the physical. That is the message that Hashem is giving in this covenant, that Hashem's spiritual entity is not removed from the world. It is a part of the world, is inspiring the world, is informing the world. Therefore, man has to reckon with that and has to take that and be inspired by it. And immediately after this, we have the incident of Noach, which perhaps is a somewhat ironic reaction. That where Noach, his children that come out the table, it says, who are his children? Shem, Cham, v'Yofes. And Cham is the Huavi Chenoan, and Shishi. He's the children of Noach, Shem, Cham, v'Yofes. And Cham is the father of Canaan. These are the three children, the Pasuk then repeats itself. These are the three children of Noach. And from these, the world was became populated. And what do you mean, these are the three? There are no more. We're going to see perhaps there had been a potential for another one. No, these are the three children. There are no more. This is the sum whole of the family of Noach. And what does Noach do? He initiated Noach, the man of the land, and planted a vineyard, and drank from the wine and became drunk. And became Vayisgal, he revealed himself in his tent. And we're told perhaps he was lying undressed and naked in a compromised position, and perhaps even his body was aroused, and therefore this was an extremely compromising and embarrassing pose to find himself in. And the question is why he even courted the potential of this spiritual challenge, which he failed apparently, or he even contemplated this, which we're going to discuss a little bit in Mitzvah Shem. And what happened? Cham perceived this, saw what his father in this compromised position, and Cham, the father of Canaan, and he saw his father's nakedness, and informed his two other brothers who were outside. And they took, Shem v'Yefes is a simla, they took the covering, there was a sheet, and they placed it on their shoulders, and they walked backwards in such a way as to ensure that he would be covered. They would walk the length of Noach's body, holding the sheet on their shoulders, but so as ensuring that they would not view their father's compromised state, and when they came to the past halfway through his body, they would be exposed to his nakedness. They again turned their heads, ensuring that they would not perceive Noach's compromised state. They did not see at all their father's nakedness, as opposed to Cham, not only saw it but also reported it, and then thereby humiliated his father. And Noach awoke from his wine and realized what had been done to him by his Bnei HaKoton, his small son. Now it's called a small son because he acted in a child and petulant and immature and humiliating manner, inappropriate manner. We'll see what's the significance of this. And he says, Oru Canaan, from here on, Canaan is to be cursed. And what is it that Cham had done to him? And there's two opinions. One is he had merely performed the actions as they are described in the Psukim, in these verses. He had exposed his father and humiliated him, but not more than that. Another opinion is, another opinion is that he had actually ravished and violated him in some form of sexual encounter. And another opinion is that seriously he had actually castrated him. And perhaps the purpose of that was to ensure that Noach would not give birth to any other children. And the Midrashim and the Forshim tell us that Noach had actually had entertained a hope that he would have another son that would serve him. And Cham had thereby dashed this possibility. And Noach therefore saying, "You've cursed me, such that I am destined not to have a fourth child." and therefore you also, Chum, I'm cursing you regarding your fourth child, who is Canaan. The children of Chum were Bnei Chum, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, Canaan. The fourth son of Chum was Canaan. Therefore, I'm also cursing you in your fourth child. And what is the curse? That Eved Avodim, he will be a servant to his brothers. And he said, Shem is to be blessed, or the God of Shem is to be blessed, and Canaan will be the servant of Shem. And Hashem will may grace perhaps Yefes, or perhaps he will, Rashi Yarchiv, he will cause him to spread out. But Hashem's presence will reside in the tents of Shem, the Beis Hamikdash, tents of Shem, and Canaan will be their servant of Shem. So this somewhat unfortunate, tragic, but somewhat elusive incident. We want to try to understand a little bit of it. What was going on here? Why is it Noach? What was this test that he perhaps succumbed to? Why did he think he should be engaging with wine? They explained that he should have initiated perhaps his Ishwa Domo. He was the man of the ground. He did not learn from Adam himself, who also did not fail to distance himself from sin. He also nasa chulin, he perhaps made himself, defiled his holiness. As we can suggest, says that these were the three children of Noach that exited the Teva, Shem v'Cham v'Yafes. It doesn't say Es Shem Es Cham v'Yafes. It puts them together. V'Cham hu avi Canaan. These are the ones that are exiting from the Teva. And Cham is the father of Canaan, maybe in the capacity of exiting from the Teva. He already had perhaps conceived at least some of his children in the Teva. These are the three children of Noach, and from these the world became populated. Perhaps Noach, we're told, he wanted more children. Why did he want more children? He wanted another child to serve him. Perhaps because, not for selfish reasons, but that was perhaps the whole mission of Noach. Noach's whole mission is to reconstruct, spiritually rehabilitate the world. And perhaps he felt that the most appropriate, the most effective way that he could do this would be in this new world. He would, in his righteous capacity, give birth now to a child who would in no way have been come under the influence of the previous cultural regime and spiritual anarchy that existed prior to the flood. And even despite the fact that perhaps Shem, Cham, and Yafes were righteous, at least Shem, partially Yafes, and maybe partially Cham, nevertheless they had been exposed to a certain extent. And Noach maybe wished to give a birth to a son who would serve him, meaning he would serve him spiritually. Noach would be able to invest his complete spiritual energies in producing a child that would be completely spiritually unblemished. However, perhaps he prophetically understood that this is not going to be possible. Shloisha eila b'nei Noach. These are the children of Noach, and from these the world was destined to be populated. And perhaps Noach himself sensed that perhaps he's not going to be giving birth to another child, the child of his dreams that he would like to be giving birth to. And therefore, how is he going to ensure that the world is going to be populated by in an appropriate manner by spiritually attuned individuals, his progeny? So he's going to hope that Shem, Cham, and Yafes will be a satisfactory spiritual legacy of Noach. However, perhaps he was sensitive to the fact that Cham is Avi Canaan. Even in the capacity of exiting the Teva, Noach was perhaps aware of the fact that Cham was spiritually problematic. Nevertheless, you've got Shem, Cham, and Yafes. However, perhaps even Cham, as being spiritually deficient, is going to again adversely impact on Shem's madrega, on the spiritual level that Shem would be potentially able to achieve. Therefore, that's what it says, the children coming out of the table were Shem, Chum, and Yefes, were all three of them. And perhaps all three together represent too much of an entity that Noach can exert his full spiritual influence over them. Especially since Chum is integrated within them. Shem, Chum, and Yefes, they're one unit. They're brothers that perhaps are very closely united one with another. In which case Noach says, again, there's a problem for the world. So perhaps Vayochel Noach, he made himself chulin. Yochel is also Chum. He perhaps thought, anticipated that the solution is perhaps in some ways maybe to isolate. There's a problematic son, and maybe what's necessary is to isolate. And maybe Noach therefore thought that the only manner through which this can be achieved is perhaps to ultimately to expose Chum for what he is. And that's maybe why he undertook this venture. It says, first of all, let's see, there's another allusion here perhaps. Vayochel Noach ish ha'adomo. He initiated as, but however, it could not be, he did not undertake this if this would be done as a preconceived charade on the part of Noach. Maybe Chum would have been aware of it, and therefore Noach perhaps had to disguise it as a genuine, a natural occurrence of events. On what basis, Noach, under these circumstances, would Noach have sought to have planted a vineyard first and drunk from its wine? This perhaps is not appropriate conduct for the tzaddik. So there are those who wish to say Noach was perhaps depressed after he perceived the world had been completely destroyed, and he had no other possibility rather than to console himself through wine. Perhaps Vayochel Noach ish ha'adomo. Vayochel is gematria 54. 40 plus 40, 54. Noach 104, 112. Ish Aleph Yud 130, 123. He told in the Gemara in Gittin that Rabbi Tzadok, from the time that it had been decreed that the Beis Hamikdash was going to be destroyed, Rabbi Tzadok had fasted and had basically undertaken a fast for 40 years, I think, prior to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, in the merit of which he had hoped that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, will not be destroyed. Perhaps we can suggest that from the time that Noach was informed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu that the world is going to be destroyed, he certainly engaged in prayer and penitence, and perhaps even fasting, self-denial, that the world itself should not be destroyed. We're not informed of these prayers, these efforts directly, perhaps because they were not of sufficient intensity or merit that they were actually effective. Nevertheless, we can assume that Noach did undertake this. We explained, Ki oischa risi tzadik lefonai. Hashem referred to Noach, I have seen you. Lefonai, we explained this might be referring to, this referred to Noach's conduct. Perhaps he deprived himself. We can assume that maybe he would have deprived himself of wine. One is meant to limit one's intake of wine when it comes to mourning over a loss of a relation or of the Beis Hamikdash during the month of Av. So perhaps Noach, we can assume, was careful not to partake of wine once he was informed that the world itself was about to be destroyed. And how long did that period of mourning last? 120 years. And therefore Noach spent 120 years not drinking wine. Perhaps he presented this as, after 120 years of no wine, he wished to perhaps renew his acquaintance with wine, and perhaps to initiate the world on a proper footing, drinking wine with the proper self-control. So when did he start drinking wine? So let's say he planted a vineyard straight away. However, he can't eat of the fruits initially. He has to wait. How long? 3 years. And therefore, how long was it till he was able to drink wine for the first time? 123 years. Vayochel Noach ish, the Aleph Yud, is 123 years. And Shin Hey is 303. 303 is Orlo. Noach waited 120 years plus another 3 years because he was waiting for Orlo. And then he was able to partake of that. And maybe that was how it was presented, that he was sort of waiting for this opportunity that he could once again anew start drinking wine. And this, but maybe this was a preconceived charade we're suggesting, that he became naked in his tent, perhaps to test. And Chum saw this, and he failed in the test, and either whatever, he abused him sexually, or he castrated him, or just saw his nakedness. Either way, this was totally inappropriate. And Noach therefore decreed he is going to be from now on. He cursed him. Cursing means that he's b'nei koton, you are the most insignificant. And the Torah calls him this because this is perhaps what Noach wanted to engineer. That Chum will no longer be a pernicious influence over Shem. That Shem is now the master. Chum is the servant of Shem. And this means that perhaps Shem can maintain his spiritual equilibrium even in a world inhabited by Chum, because ultimately the status of Chum is now reduced to that of the servant of Shem. And maybe this is what Noach actually had wished to engineer, because initially the children of Noach are Shem, Chum, and Yafes. They're all together, and this is inappropriate for Shem. And Shloisha Eile, maybe he's going to have another child, and that will be the spiritual legacy of Noach. No, Shloisha Eile, this is all the children Noach is going to have. Therefore, he devised perhaps this plan that will expose Chum as the one who is cursed for the way he's acted, and therefore Shem will be the one who will be the master. Thereby can preserve the spiritual integrity of the world through Shem. And perhaps we have a big remez to this. Vaikach Shem v'Yefes es hasimlo. They took the sheet. Interesting word. They took the sheet. Hasimlo, the sheet or the garment. Sorry, the garment. What do you mean the garment? Which garment? Simlo. They took a garment, the one that he had removed. Perhaps Hasimlo is the one that had been prepared. Noach had prepared the garment. He prepared something. He knew that this result of his actions would be that he's going to be found in this compromising situation. And he wished thereby to test his children, to expose thereby ultimately Chum. What is Simla? The Simla is used more in Bava Metzias says when one seeks to identify something, a lost object, one identifies it through like a Simla. Like an object, an article of clothing, that it has certain simoni identifying features. That is the simla. Everything is learned out from there. That something that can be identified through its identifying features is the simla. That's the prototype, the archetypal of identification. Maybe this is what's being alluded to here. They took the simla. Noach prepared something that's going to identify. How are we going to find? We're going to expose Chum. This is through this simla, through this Sharad. And also for Su'a Simlo, when referring to the potential accusation of adultery that's leveled against the Arusa, the one who is betrothed to somebody who is husband, accuser of adultery. And the for Su'a Simlo, they will expose, they will reveal the true nature of this person who has made this false accusation. And maybe again, this Simlo, it comes to expose. It's actually a garment that covers, but it also exposes, and this was what Noach was perhaps intending. We're going to see ultimately, soon is going to trace the genealogy of the three children, Shem, Chum, and Yefes, and we see that Canaan migrates and assumes Eretz Canaan, inhabits Eretz Canaan itself. And perhaps Noach was also anticipating this. And he says, however, Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, is the place that Eni Hashem Elokecha bo, where Hashem, that is where Hashem's focus is placed. And that is the only place in the world that really Yisrael, or spiritually inspired man, can truly elevate himself in Eretz Yisrael, where he can be subject to the divine scrutiny and inspiration. And he said, how can I ensure that my righteous children will inherit Eretz Yisrael? Perhaps I anticipate that Chum is going to usurp it for himself, and thereby to thwart the spiritual intentions and pretensions of Shem, as rendering the world a spiritually habitable place. Therefore, Noach said, again, we can counter this by making, as the Das Kenim says, Chum, Canaan, will be the servant of Shem. And Masha Kona Eved, Kona Rabbis, the Das Kenim tells us. Therefore, Chum is in actual fact conquering Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel, on behalf of Shem. And this is what Noach again perhaps intended to achieve. And the Das Kenim comments, brings a medrash, fascinating medrash, that when Noach planted the kerem, the vineyard, so the Sultan came to him and said to him, I want to be also a partner, perhaps, in this venture with you, together with you. So what did the Sultan do? He brought 4 animals: a chazer, a pig, a gdi, a goat, a kevesh, a lamb, keves, a lamb, and a koif, and a monkey. And so the Rosh explains what that means. What was the significance of this? These are 4 animals who represent the potential states in which a person can find himself through drinking of wine. If he drinks too much, then he's like a chazer. He's like a sow who rolls in the mud and becomes and manure and becomes completely defiled and filthied. That's what happens to one type of person. They lie in the gutter, they roll in the gutter and all the filth. That's what happens to a drunkard. Another one that's if he drinks too much. If he drinks a little, such that he imbues within himself a sense of joy, perhaps holy joy. He can jump with great joy, alehorim, on the mountains, like a gedi, like a goat. That's the optimal intake of wine. If he drinks, it consumes a moderate amount, not the minimum, but then he will fall asleep and be like a monkey, or that acts jocularly, perhaps somewhat inappropriately, but is not rolling in the gutter. And if he eats, if he drinks during his eating, he's like a keves. Perhaps like a sheep, he becomes sheepish, maybe he becomes sleepy and inactive. These are the 4 potential states in which a person finds himself through drinking. And the Sultan perhaps partnered with Noach in this venture and brought these 4 animals to suggest this. And we can suggest that from here perhaps we can derive the source of an interesting custom. This may be being alluded to here by the Rosh. On Pesach, Seder night, what do? We have the Suda, we say the Haggadah, we have the 4 cups of wine, which is an interesting minhag. Generally, most people after the end of the Seder are somewhat jovial. There's always a risk, and we're told that the optimum wine to drink is not grape juice, but rather yain mishaker, wine that actually can make a person drunk. And perhaps one can suggest that these are viewed as the 4 cups of freedom. And the Gemara tells us, based slightly on what the Rosh has told us here, that in discussing this in Sanhedrin, ben Sori Moirer, that wine has got all sorts of properties, and it can take a person in a positive or negative direction. One of them is, if a person drinks in an inappropriate amount, then Nasir Rosh, he becomes a poor person, he becomes humiliated and defiled. On the other hand, Yain Malchus, wine also has properties of Malchus, of majesty. If a person drinks and properly controls his drink, people used to often compete themselves with drink. Who will be the first to succumb to a drunken stupor? Because wine itself is a potential for majesty. And perhaps this is the actual potential. That's really what it means. It means that there is the potential for the wine to take control of the person, for the person to become weakened and defiled and disgraced. And if a person is able to control himself, thereby that is the majesty, that is the self-control, the true self-control that a person has. He is a king over himself. And the opposite of a king is a slave. And maybe part of the idea on Leil Pesach is that these are the cups of freedom, that we consume these 4 cups of wine, and with the idea that even after having consumed these 4 cups of wine, nevertheless we maintain our spiritual equilibrium. And that itself is perhaps raising ourselves to the level of majesty, the opposite of slaves. We're no longer enslaved to our passions or to our inclinations. And that is the cups of shichur, of freedom. We're not king, we're not slaves, we're the opposite, we're actually kings. We crown ourselves on the night of Pesach. And perhaps that's why we have the custom. What do we read? What do we say at the end of the Seder? We finish Chas al Chid Seder Pesach. We have the 4 cups. We say Hallel, we say benching, we say grace, we say Hallel, praise to Hashem, and that's really the end of the Seder. We say Chas al Chid Seder Pesach, Kil Chose, we finish the order of the Pesach as is appropriate. They were then saying 2 interesting, primarily, there are 2 or 3. There's even a base, the songs of hope for the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, which is our longing for the temple and for redemption. We say also Echad Miyadea. Who knows 1? Who knows 2? 1 is Hashem in the heaven. 2 is the tablets of stone that were broken, which were given for the Torah. 3 are the forefathers, 4 are the mothers. 5 are the books of the Torah. 6 is the Mishnah. 7 are the days of the week. Of Shabbos, perhaps we're mentioning Shabbos. 8 are the days of circumcision. 9 are the months of gestation, etc. 10 are the 10 commandments. And why are we saying this? And we can suggest, according to this is part of it. Echad Miyodea. So I always thought that we're saying that, I always thought this is based on a vote I once heard that, well, it's the opposite. That when we say Ein Kelekenu Kadinenu, we say Mi Kelekenu Mi Chamaken Mi Chamishenu. We say there's none like our God, and then we ask, who is like our God? We say Baruch Elokeinu, blessed is our God. You are our God. So why do we start off saying Enkel, there's none like our God? We should start off Mikelikin, who is like our God? And the answer is Enkelikin, there's none like our God. And the answer is perhaps no, because asking the question itself is in somewhat is spiritually disrespectful and perhaps somewhat dangerous. The implication is maybe there is another answer. Maybe there is someone else apart from our God. And therefore, we have to proceed this with. We proceed this by saying, "En First of all, we predicate this as no one apart from our God, and then we can ask the question once we really know what the answer is: who is like our God? But maybe on the night of Pesach, since we have reached such sublime spiritual level, we are competent to say, "Echad miyodeh." Who knows one? The answer, obviously, Hashem is one. That is what is unity in the world. But we're able to ask the question. We don't have to predicate it with who is one. We're on a level where we can ask questions because we're confident that the answers, there will be no element of doubt in the answers. That's how I understood it maybe till now. However, one can suggest, on the basis of what we've been suggesting here, that in engaging with wine on the night of Pesach, one is presenting a spiritual challenge. And the spiritual challenge is to maintain, like we said, spiritual equilibrium despite having consumed this large amount of liquor and alcohol. And that itself is a certain degree of freedom. One rises to the level of malchus, of majesty. And what is the proof? The proof is that we maintain our spiritual integrity even in the face of having drunk. Yain v'chamri pikchin, yain actually makes us wise. However, after having consumed this significant amount of alcohol, we're not that wise. We're maybe not fit to undertake shnaim oichsin, to undertake intricate Talmudic portions. However, we wish perhaps to prove that we are nevertheless mentally, intellectually, and spiritually still fully aware. And therefore, we perform a simple test. Let's ask you these, who knows what's 1, who knows what's 2, who knows what's 3, and we respond correctly and appropriately to all these questions. We thereby demonstrate that we have maintained our equilibrium despite having drunk all this wine. And what's the next passage we see? An even more intriguing passage. Chad Gadyo, which the father bought for 2 zuzi. And there are so many explanations offered for the esoteric meaning behind this extremely elusive passage. One of the most well-known, of course, is perhaps of the Goin, that maybe this is an allusion to the events of Yaakov Avinu. He purchased a birthright, Chad Gadyo, with 2 zuzi, which was the ksuba of Rivka, etc. And as a result of that, he had to endure all the events that happened as a result of that. Esav, he was forced to flee from Esav and to deal with Lavan, etc. And that's what all the events of Chad Gadya, the description of the various protagonists. One, the cat eats the gedi, and then the dog consumes the cat, and then the stick beats the dog, and then the fire consumes the stick, and the water consumes the fire, etc. And the cow drinks the water, and the ritual slaughterer slaughters the cow, and the sultan kills the slaughterer, and Hashem deals with the sultan. And this back and forward is perhaps an allusion to the traumatic occurrences that Yisrael has to endure in the exile. And it has a particular pattern. There's a particular pattern to it. The particular pattern is that the father bought the gedi, and then the cat eats it, and then the dog eats it. The gedi was the preserve, was the possession, the dear possession of the father, and then the cat ate it. He shouldn't have done that, and therefore, perhaps what happens is divinely inspired a revenge. It is avenged. So the dog eats the cat. The cat should not have eaten the gedi, and therefore the dog consumes the cat. However, evil will always seek to raise its head, and therefore the stick comes along and beats the dog, which ate the cat. It's all coming again to reassert the appropriateness, perhaps, that the cat should have eaten the gedi, because the dog that consumed the cat itself is beaten, and then comes along another age, the fire will consume the stick that beats the dog. Again, to avenge that, the gedi. So it's really about the narrative of rise and fall, exile and redemption, as a constant narrative, a constant dynamic that exists until ultimately, also HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem is the final factor beyond which there is nothing else. Cause of all causes, everything, that He will ultimately come and redeem and avenge even the slaying of, the eating of the gedi, of the goat, which represents Yisrael. Hashem will ultimately be the Redeemer of Yisrael. That's maybe what it's saying. Which is again part of this theme of preserving one's equilibrium, that one potentially can lose it. That's what the wine does, perhaps, and one sustains oneself. All this perhaps is leading to suggestion that this maybe is what the Rosh has in mind. That he says there are 4 animals the Sultan brought which depict the states in which a person finds himself in consuming wine. Maybe these 4 states represent, we've drunk 4 cups of wine, and potentially we can find ourselves in any of one of these 4 states. And which is the optimal state in which we wish to find ourselves? Perhaps that of the gedi. The gedi is the one that finds itself inspired and enamored and enjoyed through having consumed wine, and it is enthusiastically jumping on the mountains. That what does it do? Jumps from the mountains like a gedi. And perhaps that's what we're singing, Chad Gadyo. That's why we sing the Chad Gadyo. To symbolize that, after having drunk all this wine, we know we are still rationally intact. Therefore, we wish to be considered like the gedi. The wine has not bettered us; on the contrary, it has bettered us in the most positive sense of the word. Like the gedi, we've taken the wine and taken it and channeled it towards the gedi type energies. Maybe this is the allusion. What we're saying. He says, what are the 4 animals? Chazer, Gedi, Kevesh, V'koif. Chazer, Gedi is Ches Gimel. Maybe this is an allusion to Chad Gadyo. That's what it means. We say Chad Gadyo, Chazer, Gedi. And what are the other 2? The Kevesh and the Koif. Kevesh and the Koif is 120. So first of all, maybe this would refer to this 120 happens also to be perhaps the period which Noach spent in self-denial of wine. Essentially, it was a 120-year period, and perhaps that caused the reaction. The Kevesh and the Koif, he had hoped that he would emerge a Gedi, and ultimately, unfortunately, he emerged more like the Chazer. And what do we say? Chad Gadio. And how do we spell it? If you take Chad Gadio, Chad is 8 and 4 is 12. Gadio is 7, 17, 18. 18 plus 12 is 30. You say Chad Gadio, Chad Gadio. Why do we say it twice? 30 and 30 is 60. The Zabin Abba Bitrei Zuzi, which the father bought for 2 zuz, 2 coins. Chad Gadio, again, Chad Gadio. Chad Gadio is 30, twice is 60. Altogether, how much is it in each refrain? 60 and 60 is 120. So maybe Chad Gadio is a reference to the 4 types of manner in which a person can be identified after having drunk wine. Chad Gadio is Ches Gimel, the Chazer or the Gedi. And what remains? The Keves and the Koif is 120. Chad Gadio is 120. Zabin Abidju Chad Gadio 120. Maybe we're alluding to this, that in actual fact we have emerged from this emphasizing we are the Gedi. Maybe that's why the Rosh says, what's the Gedi? Mikabit alak voice Kegedi. This maybe is a reference to the pasuk, of course, in Shirushim. Litzmi, Mikabit ala horim, Medalig ala horim, Mikabit alak voice, Litzmi, or Lo'ofer Hawayolim, which perhaps is the Gedi. And that's why we read Shirushim. Again, to say that we have emerged triumphant from this benign trial. And this is maybe why we read Chad Gadio. And this may be what the Rosh is telling us. The riot from Noach, that perhaps we wish to, Noach also had hoped that he would emerge as the Gedi. Unfortunately, he was found as the more akin to perhaps the Chazer, unfortunately. But as we suggested, perhaps this was in actual effect premeditated on the part of Noach. Maybe you can say it's perhaps rumors, it's perhaps alluded to Vayochel Noach. Vayochel is like Vai, it's Lashon Vai, it's an expression of lamenting and great despondency. Vai, it's terrible. What? That Chal, he became Cholin. Chal is he had hoped that he would be the Gedi in the Chad Gadio. Chad Gadio is 30, that's the Lamed. He had hoped he would become the Lamed, that's what he would derive from this. Unfortunately, he became the Ches, the Chazer. Unfortunately, that's the Vai, the Ches instead of the Lamed. But it was perhaps ultimately the Ches is not the Chazer, the Ches was to render Chum, the servant of Shem. And maybe this is expressed maybe Shin Ches, Chum and Shem. Shin Ches was the year when perhaps sovereignty was accorded to the Jews in their native land, to the extent that one views this as a benevolent expression of divine providence. Says in the story with Shem, Chum and Yefes, when Noach got drunk, says that Vayikach Shem Vayefes. And my friend Shimi Kornfeld reminded me, there's a vault I'd forgotten, that Chazal tell us that because it says Vayikach, singular, Shem and Yefes took this simla together. However, it was actually Shem who exerted himself to greater extent. He was the prime initiator, perhaps, of covering up Noach, saving him from this disgrace. And because of this, they were both rewarded. Shem was rewarded with the mitzvah of tzitzis, and Yefes was rewarded that he was. So Shem was given the mitzvah of tzitzis, the privilege of tzitzis, and Chum was given and Yefes was given kfur at the time of Goig u'Mogog, that they will merit to be buried. And the question asked, why is this the appropriate reward for either and both of them? And so The answers given are along what Reb Shimi said. I put it like this. I'm going to get my signon, because we've talked a lot about Kvura. What is the meaning of Kvura? And we've spoken about even the context of ancient Egypt. There's a lot about that. What is the idea of Kvura? Why is Kvura so important? We explained very, very briefly, I'm going to say now. The idea of Kvura, what is the chesed? Why is Kvura so important? Why is burial so important? We suggested like this, that essentially a person in this world has a Yetzer Hara. A person is inclined towards materialism, hedonism, and performing the will of Hashem is a challenge. One of the main challenges is it's an olam. We live in an olam, a world where olam means hidden. Hashem has hidden himself. It's almost axiomatic for the existence of the world for Hashem to be hidden. That presents a challenge for Yirah Shamayim, for a person to have the proper fear of Hashem, to be inspired to do the mitzvahs as one should be. And one of the prime motivating factors enabling a person to enhance the Yiras Hashem is Liskar Yom HaMisa, to contemplate the day when he'll die. I once explained, I don't think I'm the only one to explain this, that look at three things you'll never sin. Where did you come from? Tipas ruchol. Ana tohileich, hakam rima v'tila. Lifnei mi ata osid litin din v'cheshben. Lifnei melech malchi amlochim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes, what's the three things? Contemplating perhaps your tipas ruchon, that what are these three things? And you're going to mokam rima v'tila, you're going to become worms. You were tipas ruchon, you were just a drop of wasted material, almost something completely insignificant, and you're going to become something even more insignificant, worms. So perhaps this inspires humility. I'm a nothing, so what right do I have to sin and not to obey my Creator, etc. That perhaps is a straightforward understanding. And I suggested maybe there's also another understanding behind this, that essentially is one thing that inspires a person to Yirah Shamayim, to fear, and that is lifnei mi ata osid litan din v'cheshbon. Before whom are you going to have to give din v'cheshbon? You're going to have to give an accounting of all your actions throughout your life. You're going to have to do it through the omnipotent judge, with whom there is no possibility of excuse or ransom or bribery or favor of any sort whatsoever. The absolute truth from the absolute infinitely knowledgeable and infinitely powerful judge. That should be sufficient to motivate anyone to be completely, utterly careful in every single action, with every single fiber of their existence. Yet we fail perhaps to exhibit such an appropriate fear, because we live in a world that's hidden, or we live in a different dimension. We view ourselves perhaps as in this world, and the world where we're going to have to give accounting is like a different world, a different person. It's going to be a totally different dimension, a different identity almost. It's not us. Therefore, it's not something that we feel, somehow we convince ourselves, we try to convince ourselves that something is not even we have to to acknowledge, to take note of. And this the Mishnah is telling us, is apprising us of our, that notion is mistaken. Me'ayin ba'asa, you came from nothing and you're going to be nothing. You're going to be a worm and earth, nothing. Therefore, you perhaps think that, yes, now I am the significant person. I've got blood, flesh, bones, muscles, abilities, convictions, opinions, etc. I'm a being. I've got significance. Therefore, the me that's going to be, perhaps ultimately, spirit floating around in the celestial bodies, is a completely different entity. I do not have to, or not able even to contemplate that anticipated future dimension. And the Mishnah is telling us that you absolutely do have to, because this is actually a figment of your imagination. You think the true you is the me, the significant me with all my body and muscles and my physical being. No, essentially you were nothing and you're going to be a nothing. And therefore this is like an apparition. It's a temporary, suspended state you find yourself in during this lifetime. But essentially it's inevitable, absolutely inevitable. And it's part of the fundamental same state of you that you're going to rejoin the world, after which you're going to immediately encounter the din lifnei melech malchim malchim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're going to have to give this accounting. And that's what it should inspire you to true fear of heaven. And therefore it's the contemplation of a person's ultimate fate that really perhaps is the sole and ultimate source of Yiras Shamayim, of divine holy inspiration to conduct oneself as one should. Within that context, one can suggest, this is what I suggest, this is really what's the important part of Kvura, of burial. That if a person can internalize that the stage immediately following death is that one is going to be judged, one is going to come up upon high, then to that extent one can focus with greater clarity on that eventuality already at this stage of one's existence. The extent that one can distance oneself from that, then one is going to be less able to identify with the final ultimate judgment. And that perhaps is where burial, the purpose that burial serves, Kvura. But we know, for example, that there's a tzar, there's a certain pain. This is one of the rationales given for burial, that the neshama suffers a certain pain, that it is pain that it is essentially its destination now is towards the heavenly chambers, heavenly dimension. Yet, so long as the person is not buried, his body, so to speak, remains intact, remains a part of the world, and therefore the soul is almost against its will forced to remain attached to its incorporeal self, to its physical representation. That causes great suffering and great, perhaps kafakela, great confusion to the soul, and that it's drawn between these two destinies and histories, I might say. And if one, to the extent that one can expedite Kvura burial, then the soul is relieved of this inchoate state, of this suspended animation. Straight away, the body ceases to exist and the soul is summoned above. To that extent, that process is an instant process and is perceived by society in general, as to the extent that society views this as a natural transition, that burial is the automatic and immediate consequence of death. To that extent, society is also focused on contemplating the events that follow immediately after death, i.e. burial and meeting one's maker, being judged. To the extent that burial is delayed, so one is that perhaps provides the mind with the ammunition to create the disparity, to create the hiatus, the differential between this world and the next. The next world is again something else. To the extent that burial is not instant, is not immediate. To the extent that burial is something that is readily going to be facilitated, one is already contemplating naturally the next world and being judged and the fear of heaven. To that extent, Yiras Shamayim in the world itself is enhanced. Therefore, the institution of Kvura, of being buried, is so vital to everything, to maintaining perhaps the whole of Yiras Shamayim, of morality in this world. Perhaps the sole source of morality is in actual fact that divinely inspired fear of having to give this accounting. Therefore, we can suggest with this rationale, this is what Chazal mean, that Shem took the initiative and wanted to restore his father's religious and holy dignity in covering him with the with the greatest possible efficiency and speed. He was rewarded with the mitzvah of tzitzis. Mitzvah of tzitzis, fringes, is a mitzvah that one contemplates him, one contemplates the tzitzis and immediately is inspired with fear of Hashem and to perform all his mitzvahs. And it's a mitzvah that is extremely accessible. It's part of getting dressed, part of wearing clothes. It does not require any special, unique preparation or conditions or times. One wakes up in the morning, one puts it on, and one straight away has the tools, the vehicle for enhancing one's Yiras Shamayim. Perhaps therefore Shem was correspondingly rewarded with, in his seeking to enhance his father's the glory of heaven and the fear of heaven, without delay, he was rewarded with a highly accessible tool for enhancing Yiras Shamayim. Yefes, on the other hand, who perhaps delayed somewhat, he was also rewarded with a vehicle for enhancing Yiras Shamayim, namely Kvura, burial. That also is something that enhances Yiras Shamayim. However, that is something that essentially is not quite as accessible, it's not quite as instant. It's something that only appears at the end of life, and therefore even in contemplating it, does not have the same force as placing on a beged, placing on an apparel, and being inspired to Yiras Shamayim. Something that has to be sort of contemplated in the distant future. And that corresponded to Yefes's also delaying, even if only minimal, that he was not sufficiently, was not quite sufficiently desirous and eager to perform this mitzvah, and therefore the divine aid that he was given in fear of Hashem was correspondingly of a somewhat delayed nature.